Hello, hey class. I am back. This is Dr. Eunice. I just want to finish up this class. My notes. I'm going over the social research part of your studies, so that you can be ready, completely ready for your exam. So I hope that this is going to help you prepare, because this part is obviously going to be in the exam. So I don't know if you have asked this question. You have asked yourself this question: why do we do social research? That's the question that I'm going to answer here, as I also explain how we do research in sociology or in social sciences, or science in general. So stay here with me. So I will be expecting you guys to go over these notes and make sure that you take notes. Yeah, and then we'll be done with that, with this class. Okay. So if you have any questions, as I've said, you can always comment in the comment section of where you're going to get this, the media where you're going to get this information, and especially YouTube. So we do research as scientists, because without research, our knowledge would really be the knowledge of the social world would be limited. Because if we only analyze the world using our immediate and limited life experiences, then we wouldn't know anything else that happens out there in the social world. Just because we live in a society, doesn't mean that we know everything that happens in the society. If we don't do some type of systematic research, we can't know even the most basic or complex questions. We will not be able to answer those questions, which are very, very important. You know why? Because we don't provide services. We do not create. We also don't create policies for people that we don't understand. We have to understand how the society looks like. So it's questions like, how many people live in Kenya? How many people live in the world? Why is socioeconomic status, or poverty or wealth, or related to somebody's behavior when they grow older? So those are the questions we ask. There's a lot of research that has been done to answer this question, like risks that are related to maladaptive behavior in youth. And one of them is really socioeconomic status. So that's how those questions are asked, by conducting research. We will be able to know how human beings interact, the structures and of the institutions, and even the families, by conducting research. So we can know the patterns, how families interact with each other, how cultural groups interact with each other, even institutions as big as the government, how policies are formulated, as well as how are those policies integrated into the larger community to be able to provide intervention, for communities. So I will take you through the research, the scientific research process, this is a very universal, stage or stages for conducting research. So wherever you go, whether you go to another country, whether you're in Kenya, whether you're in UK or US, there's that, there is that structured process of doing scientific research that you cannot ignore. So we start by asking a question, just like I gave you an example. How do we know how many children are in Kenya? How do we know how many single mothers are in Kenya? That's the question that we have. That's where you start. So whatever question that you are asking in research is what guides you into the next stage. So if you're talking about societal issues or a phenomenon, a phenomena that is warranting investigation through research, this is where you began. So you have to ask that question: does it make sense to to conduct research, to answer that question? And why is it important? Again, I said, it just covers a lot of reasons why we have to answer such questions. So the next stage is we are going to do research existing sources. In here, we are engaging with existing scholarship. We want to build upon the knowledge that we have, the knowledge that is driving you to ask that question. We build upon it by identifying the research gaps. If other people have done research, we go to the library. Now we don't have to go to physical library anymore because we have digital libraries where you can pull up articles based on the subject that you are wanting to research on. If it's medical, if it's if you're researching about sociology or social issues, you are going to get those documents and pull up literature that actually is related to your question so that you can identify. Don't do research that has already been done. Like, don't double in research. You can build onto other people's research. Maybe you go and read their research and find out that in the recommendation or conclusion they did say that this research can be expanded by asking this question, by doing it with this population, using a different method, which we're going to talk about those methods. So you want to do a research that hasn't, so it is unique, it's original. You're going to ask a question that has never been asked, and if it has been asked in a different country, maybe you are studying a research, the same research that has been done elsewhere has been researched in a different country. So, for example, when I was doing my PhD, I was asking a question. The question that I asked was based on something that I had witnessed. I had witnessed these children that had been abused, sexually abused, that concerned me. And I was wondering, the question was, why did they not say? So that's the question I posed. Like, why do children not say when they are sexually abused? I went into the field, into the literature. I looked up. That question had never been asked in Kenya. That question had been asked elsewhere, but nobody had ever actually done a research interviewing victims or survivors in their childhood. So that's what I did. So my research was unique in a way that it had never been done in Kenya, but also, even though it had been done, maybe asking the same questions to adults who had grown up after they had survived abuse, I was actually interviewing children in a hospital setting, those who came to receive professional help, maybe medicational help, and I was there to do that kind of research. So I formulated my hypothesis. Of course, my research, it's not every research that is gonna require you to formulate hypothesis. So the hypothesis part is definitely based on the method of the research that you actually choose. If you want to do a quantitative research, you would definitely come up with, because you're talking about specific numbers, and in comparison, most likely doing an experimental research, which is very different from a qualitative research. So formulating hypotheses, it's allowing you to craft some testable statements that you are going to propose that will show the relationships between the variables that you're going to investigate about. So, for example, if you say that something like studying very early in the morning is related to very good grades in college. Okay, so in this case, you would you would have a hypothesis that would propose that there is a relationship, and those people who study very early in the morning get, A and above. So that is kind of like you are predicting what the results would show. Okay, so that's a statement that you can actually prove at the end of the research. After you have investigated, after you've gone to different colleges, you can go to JQuat and ask the students that wake up, and also ask the students that don't wake up, and then compare the results. So you had already predicted that those who studied in the morning, very early in the morning, would be getting better grades than those who never study in the morning, or maybe they studied late at night. And of course, this needs to be proven by your data. Okay, so we're going to talk about the next thing after you formulate the hypothesis. Now, because you already know the question you're asking, you have also looked at other research, literature review, and other people that have conducted research. When you are doing all that information, it's kind of like guiding you what route you're going to go. Because if people say, this research is it's not going to be beneficial if it's done cross-sectional or something like that, it's long-term, or interviewing this type of participants. So by the time you are designing your research method, it's because you have been informed by those people that have already done research that is close to yours, if that makes sense. So after you have designed a study, a method of study, you have come up with the number of participants that you need, you have gotten all the regulatory notes or permits that you need to conduct research, then you can go ahead and start collecting your data. Okay, so that is a design and conduct, design and conduct stage. Of course, once you have collected your data, there is a part of analysis where we actually do analysis. So based on however your data looks like, you can do your analysis based on your data. So if you have narratives, if you have numbers that you need to put in the computer and analyze, that's what you're gonna do. So that's information that you don't need for the test. But once you collect your data, you bring it back to the to your office or your computer, and then you actually formulate your conclusions. Okay, so remember, you had a question you're asking, but there's something that you're investigating. So that is how do you conclude your question based on what you have found out? Okay, so your findings. And then of course there's a requirement for you to do what? To report your results. So most of the research, especially for graduate school, you are going to report, you're going to present to an audience, you're going to present in conferences. PhD requires that you publish your data into journals that are verified, or they're journals that are actually empirical, or you are going to be required to present in conferences. So that's what happens in the reporting analysis, because you don't want to put that information, whether you're going to publish a journal or a book, or you're going to put it in a library, digital library for your university. That's part of reporting. So make sure that you're reporting information, just what comes from your data, not what you guessed along the way. Okay. So then the next, excuse me, I guess I have talked about everything regarding data analysis. There's the statistical techniques that you don't need to really study a lot for this exam, but that is important. Dissemination of the results is sharing your results to other people that are doing research, academic, policy makers, and also in your work. When you're doing your job, you can be guided by research that has been done, because you want to provide, evidence-based methods or techniques when you're doing your professional work, if that makes sense. Okay. So let's define hypothesis, because I already talked a little bit about the hypothesis. So what is hypothesis in research definition? So a hypothesis is a specific, clear, and testable proposition or predictive statement, about the possible outcome of scientific research, as I have explained, based on particular property of population, such as presumed differences between groups on particular variable relationships, and between variables. So for the null hypothesis, obviously this is something that sometimes people get confused about null hypothesis. So to test a hypothesis, the researcher first assumes that there is no difference. So that is what you're talking about. There is no difference. So you have this assumption that, okay, so if I treat this group and the other control group, there's not going to be any difference. If I give children candy and I don't give the other kids candy and I tell them to run, I don't think that anybody's going to run because they got a candy. They're going to run because they loved running. So there is no difference. That's what you're talking about. So that's the null hypothesis. There's no difference between populations, if that makes sense. So no difference. This is known as a null hypothesis, and it is denoted by letter HO. And then, of course, the alternative hypothesis is denoted by HA. So there is another example that I want to give you for null hypothesis. If you can say, like, if you're doing research on academic achievement, you can say something like, there's no difference in academic achievement between students who attend public schools and those who attend private schools. So when you're going research, that is your null hypothesis. And then, of course, your alternative hypothesis is what I'm going to explain. It's the alternative hypothesis proposes the presence of a significant relationship or effect between variables. So your alternative hypothesis of the one that I just gave for the null would be students who attend private schools demonstrate higher academic achievement compared to those in public schools. So you are going to have these two hypotheses, the null and alternative. So you can if you find that there's a difference, you are going to adopt the alternative or you're going to reject the null hypothesis, if that makes sense. So that there's also another example here. A score principle claims that students in high school score an average of 7 out of 10. The null hypothesis is that the population mean is 7. All right. So let's talk about how to conduct research in sociology. So social research requires careful planning. We're talking about careful planning. So because social research requires established procedures to ensure that knowledge is objective, just like the way I told you that there's one method, there's the stages that you have to follow and you cannot skip any of those stages. So information is gathered that reflects what is really out there in the social rather than subjective, where it only reflects the narrow opinions of the researchers. So, people that, always talk about their subjective opinions are obviously not doing good to the researchers, because we have people that are always posting things on social media, especially on social policies or even information that is not correct. And we know that from the beginning we say that's called pseudoscience. So we want to have research that is carefully done so that we can keep the integrity of the science itself, if that makes sense. So so we are going to talk about qualitative data. So remember I mentioned a little bit about qualitative data. So qualitative data information is the information that appears in written, visual, or audio form, such as transcripts of interviews, newspapers, and websites. It's possible to analyze qualitative data and display features of it numerically. So let's say, like, for example, when I said that I was working with child survivors, I went to the hospital and I was writing everything that the kids were saying. I was not able to do audio recording because some of the families were not comfortable being videotaped or audio recorded because of privacy and confidentiality, and just the worry that somebody might hear their voice, especially their perpetrators. So that data that I was collecting, because it wasn't A, B, C, D or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 high, we have those scales. I wasn't collecting that type of data. It was their narratives. I was listening to the child's narrative, like as they gave their story of abuse, as they described the person that abused them and their relationship and things like that. So that's what you're calling the qualitative data. So the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data is this. So qualitative data doesn't involve numerical data. It's non-numerical. It's supposed to really capture the insights, the meanings and the interpretations that your participants are going to be giving you. So if I can give you examples, when you're doing the interview, there are transcripts, and then I had a notebook where I was writing, and, I was asking questions and they were answering those questions without any limitation. Like it wasn't like, I feel good or bad, something like that. It is like they would explain if they felt good or bad, what does that mean to them? So those are their insights. And of course, the interpretation of that abuse, how they interpreted it, how they interpreted what took place after the abuse, something like that, okay? So for the quantitative data, which is the opposite of qualitative. You can do quantitative data and qualitative data at the same time, because most of the bio data, especially the age, is considered quantitative. So you have a little bit of quantitative data, but most of your work is qualitative, if that makes sense. So quantitative data refers to information that appears in numerical form or in the form of statistics. So we're talking about the numerical data that is definitely going to be put into the statistical analysis. It helps us to identify patterns, relationships, correlations, and trends. So when you're talking about this one, is where we are talking about, somebody looking at people's scores, like if public school or private school students, which one would score better, you'll be looking at their scores. You'll be looking at, how they perform. So that we're talking about numerical data. It's not just saying that one child is smart and the other one is not smart or something like that. It's looking at those numbers and putting on the computer and analyzing them, if that makes sense. So the data collection, it's also very, very important to know that how we collect data in social science. So we do interviews. So interviews is a method of gathering information. You ask questions. There are oral questions that you ask. You meet with the participants, you introduce yourself, they sign the consent, and then you have this face-to-face meeting, or now because of COVID, a lot of research is also being done over the telephone or just the video call. So you do interviews and ask questions systematically. You have open-ended questions. You tell somebody to explain. So you can ask somebody, could you explain to me what happened after this? Could you explain what happened to you? So you're using questions that you have probably already written down, that you'll be taking to the field. So for the interviews, we do have the structured interviews, which are basically social surveys, which are read out by this researcher. They use preset, standardized, typically closed questions. The aim of structured interview is to produce quantitative data. This is where you ask somebody, what is your what's your grade? Is your grade, so you give them like examples of A, B, C, D. So they tell you it's A or B. So you have that structured. So they are not having to explain more than that. And then the unstructured interviews, definitely. Unstructured interviews, also known as informal interviews, usually guided conversation. So this is what you would use especially for your qualitative data. So you are doing the informal interviews and you have this guided conversation you have with your clients, because you want to make sure that your guided conversation is not taking too much time. So usually before you go into the field, you might have already asked questions, like doing the preparation. There is a time you have with your partners, your research partners, and you ask them questions and you make sure that those questions are going to be okay for your clients, okay? And also maybe even pace how much time it takes for someone to answer that question. So involve the researcher asking open questions which generate qualitative data. Researcher starts with a general research topic and ask questions in response to the various differentiated responses. Then we are talking about, you are given a question like, where do you come from? Tell me more. How would you define your family? So those are other added questions that you can ask, the follow-up questions. As unstructured interviews are thus flexible, not like the structured ones, and they're respondent-led. So based on the answer that you got, if it is not going to complete your investigation, you might ask follow-up questions. So if somebody said, I was abused, then you would ask, could you please explain who abused you and what happened, or something like that, okay? So we have different types of research studies that we do. We'll explain briefly. This is also important for your exam. So we do have cross-sectional study. So scientists study a number of individuals of different ages who have the same traits or characteristics of interest at a single time. So this is how it looks like. When it says cross-sectional, you always have to remember this is a single time. You're doing this research one day and you're done, okay? Obviously, it involves a number of individuals, different ages. They might have the same traits or characteristics of interest. And then maybe you can if you go to a school, you call all the 7th graders, you go to their classroom and ask those questions. It is one day and you're done, and you go analyze your data. So that's what you call the cross-sectional study. So sensitivity to other norms, folkways, values, moral attitudes, morals, attitude, customs, and I see some spelling mistakes on my computer. Practices and necessitates knowledge of other societies and cultures. So if you're going to a school somewhere in Kisumu and you just want to understand how different cultures, value education and how they prepare their children to go to school and how much interest they have in their children passing. So you just go to the school and you want to know those customs and practices, or you can go to a certain village and just call all the young moms and ask questions. So you do a cross-sectional study and you're done, and you go make your analysis. And of course, this one is that's done. So that's what cross-sectional study is all about. For the longitudinal study, so we have scientists study the same individuals or society repeatedly. So the difference is repeatedly over a specified period of time. And remember, the only way I remembered longitudinal study is this word long. It's over time. So it is not one time. It's not Boom, I go one day and I finish. So this is this is a research that I'm probably gonna do over for maybe even 5 years. Like I ask questions when the kids are class 1. I go back next year when they're in class 2. I go back in, after every 2 years or every 1 year, I go and I'm following the same group, okay? So the same individuals, or in the same society. I can go to the university and ask the first year students some questions based on their satisfaction on their major that they were called to do. And then I go second year and I follow up and I'm still looking at their satisfaction. Has it gone down? Has it gone higher? Are they interested in the major that they're doing? How do they foresee their success? And I go back when they're in fourth year. I go back when they're in the fifth year, and I go back when they're graduated, they're working, and so that's a long period. So this is what you're talking about, long, if that makes sense. So that's something that you really need to understand because it's important for your exam, just in case you have that question and somebody gave you like if there was a question that asked, the difference between the two, okay? So the experimental research, so in experimental research, what we attempt to determine how and why something happens. Experimental research tests the way in which independent variable, which is also called the IV and D. This is the IV because it's independent variable. So the, what do you call that? The abbreviation. And then we have the factor that the scientist manipulates and then affects how it affects the dependent variable. So I remember I had a very hard time understanding these two terminologies. And the only way that I usually tell the students to try and remember is when you're a student, like for example, now that you are in college, you are probably a dependent. You're probably a dependent child to your parent, right? You're probably a dependent, right? So dependent child. So this one is there. And then who would be independent parent? An independent parent. So your parent doesn't depend on you, you depend on your parent. So what that means is that the person that is depending on the other is definitely the dependent variable. The person that is being dependent on is the independent variable. So if we have a test that we are doing in experimental research, for example, let's say we are manipulating, I want to say something, we would be doing an experimental research in sociology, would be something like how income relates to marriage satisfaction, okay? So what would depend on marriage satisfaction? Income would depend on marriage satisfaction. So marriage satisfaction is the one that's depending on income, okay? So the income becomes the independent variable and the marriage satisfaction becomes the dependent variable. So if I am manipulating the income of a couple, of maybe I have 20 couples or 30 couples, and I'm doing a quantitative research, which is scientific, experimental research, I am pumping money into their accounts. I started with them when they didn't have money or they had a little bit of money, and I measured their satisfaction. I had these tools, scales that I gave them, and they filled out. And I am trying to figure out how satisfied they are in their marriage. So then I say, okay, every 2 years or every 2 months, I'm going to be adding money into the account. So I will put money into the account, but I will not put money into the control group. So there's a difference between that. When you're doing an experiment, you're manipulating one group and the other group is control because you want to compare. So the people that have money and the people that don't have money. That's, I hope that's a good example for you to remember. So then I'm going to measure and see how, I'm going to ask them the same questions after every 2 months, and then I'm going to try to see whether their marriage satisfaction is depending on income, if that makes sense. So I hope you get the difference between DV, and it's very, very important that you know whether you're going to graduate school or, after this. That was always it's always a very hard time for many people to understand that, but it gets easier as you continue to study. So there are limitations for experimental research. There are limitations. So finding samples that are random and representative of the population being studied is always a very huge, it's a limitation. And the reason why it's a limitation is because, especially for human research, sometimes it can be very, very hard to really manipulate samples. Like if you're trying to measure the level of abuse in, you can't do an experimental research on when you're studying something like abuse, because are you going to abuse some children so that you can measure maybe the impact of abuse on their IQ? So that would be very hard. So sometimes it's very hard to find, who is going to be manipulated. So experimental bias, in which the research expectations about what should or should not happen in the study sway the results. So maybe when you're going in there and you're spending all this time, you're looking at a certain result. You want to see that, the more abuse happens, the more child's intelligence or scores go low. So you have that bias. Controlling for extraneous variables. That one is also very, very difficult sometimes for experimental research, because how do you make sure that only the abuse is impacting the dependent variable? Only abuse is affecting how that child scores in the exams, because there could be other extraneous factors, such as, family violence, mom being hit by father. It's not definitely child abuse, but we know that that also can be also another form of abuse that could prevent, or a factor that could prevent the child from performing well in school. It could be, like the example that I was talking about, the people that wake up very early in the morning. Maybe those people that wake up very early in the morning are all the bright students. Maybe that's who they are. It doesn't have to do with the time they wake up. Maybe all the people that wake up in the morning, they're just smart, and they know that waking up in the morning makes them study better, or their brain works better in the morning. So it might be very, very hard to control for the extraneous. Those are the extraneous variables. Maybe in the morning when they wake up, they get to exercise, and maybe they get a cup of coffee. Maybe there's somebody who is serving them pancakes in the morning, and that makes them really study hard. So those could be other, other extraneous factors that are very, very hard to account for in experimental research. So, for example, something like room temperature, noise level, that may interfere with the results of the experiment. So if you're doing a research somewhere, like maybe maybe the laboratory is very, very close to the highway and there's a lot of noise, so that, manipulating the independent variable might not be the only reason why you are getting that result. Maybe it's just the noise that comes through the walls that is affecting. Maybe you're doing a study that's something to do with children crying over during a certain time, and maybe they're crying during that time not because they're hungry. They're crying because there's too much noise coming from the roads, or students making noise. Unless the experimenter carefully controls for extraneous variables, which is also sometimes very, very hard, because remember, when you're doing research, sometimes those people go home and something might impact how they act tomorrow. So you can't control over what happened when they went home, when they were not in the laboratory. It's hard to draw valid conclusions about the effects of specific variables on other variables, if that makes sense. All right, so correlational research. A correlation is a research between two variables. A correlation is a relationship between two variables, or factors that change. So, for example, like I said, there is a correlation between, marital satisfaction and income level, or something like that. So that's what you're talking about, the correlation. How do they relate? Factors like characteristics, attitudes, behaviors, or events. Correlation research attempts to determine if a relationship exists. So when you hear something like correlation, we don't talk about causes, because sometimes we use the wrong English and we say that something caused the other. We are very, very careful in social research or any other scientific research when we are talking about correlation. We talk about they are related, because sometimes it's very hard to really tell the cause of something. So know that there's negative and positive correlation. And if I can explain that maybe on an open, so when you are collecting your data and you have the intelligence going high, so that's a positive correlation. That's what we call positive correlation. Positive correlation. But if you are, if you're talking about, the intelligence, or talking about the grades going low, that's negative correlation. So between DV and IV, the relationship between that. So if we are talking about the DV being income, or maybe just, parental income. Now, the IV would be parental income. I can write. I'm using my iPad. And then the DV would be, what would be the dependent variable of parental income? We're talking about children's scores or grades. Okay, so child's grade. Okay, so what you're talking about. The higher the income becomes, child's grades go high as well. Okay, so that's a positive relationship because they are going in the same direction. If the income is going higher and the grades are coming down, then that's a negative relationship. It's as simple as that. Okay? Positive relationship, they're going the same direction. Negative relationship, they're going different direction. This is very basic scientific information that you just need for your test at your grade level. Maybe when you go to master's level, you will understand these things in a better way, because maybe you're just gonna be taking a whole research course in your study. So all the best. If you have any questions, please let me know. I will be happy to answer. For now, may you have a good day. Bye.